When a storm cuts off an island from the world, a young girl turns to the one friend no one would expect, a seabird she once saved. What happens next becomes a legend, carried on wings. The island of Lysmere was small, barely a dot on most maps. But to Ailsa, it was the whole world. It was a place of rocky cliffs, windswept heather, and the constant lullaby of waves brushing the shore. She had grown up with sea salt in her hair and the cries of gulls overhead, her boots forever damp from exploring tide pools, and her pockets always filled with driftwood, shells, and other coastal treasures. She lived with her grandfather Yuan in a small weathered cottage at the island's edge. Yuan had once been the island's lighthouse keeper before the new automated light was installed. Even now, well into his 70s, he still climbed the spiral steps every week to clean the lens and polish the brass out of habit. And maybe, Ailsa sometimes thought, to hold on to what remained of the past. Ailsa was 13 that year, the year the storm came, and more attuned to sorrow than most girls her age. Her parents had died in a boating accident when she was 5, and Yuan had raised her with quiet resilience and endless love. He was her anchor, her history, and her only family. It was also the year she found the Seabird. She had named it Brisa. The gull had been caught in fishing wire, its wing bloodied and limp. Ailsa had discovered it under the willow tree her grandfather had planted the year her parents died. The tree bent with the wind, its branches whispering secrets, and under its weeping canopy, she had slowly nursed the bird back to health. Brisa was unlike other seabirds. She wasn't afraid of Ailsa's touch. She had dark, intelligent eyes and a way of cocking her head as if listening to every word the girl spoke. Over the months, she began to visit the cottage daily, often bringing shiny trinkets, bits of glass, lost buttons, even an old lighthouse key Ailsa had once misplaced. "Maybe she's a spirit," Yuan joked one evening as Brisa pecked gently at the windowpane, a seashell clasped in her beak. "Maybe she's just kind," Ailsa said. But kindness, Yuan had told her, was its own kind of magic. Then came the storm. It arrived like a sudden grief, dark, roaring, merciless. The wind howled through the eaves and the sea turned to steel. Rain lashed the windows and the lighthouse beacon blinked like an anxious heartbeat across the waves. Yuan had collapsed the night before, a sharp pain in his chest stealing the breath from his lungs. Ailsa had tried the radio, the landline, everything. But the storm had knocked out the power and severed all communication. The mainland was miles away, unreachable by boat in that weather. And Yuan was getting worse. In desperation, Ailsa turned to the one soul she had left. She tied a note to Brisa's leg, a plea, coordinates, the words, help, grandfather ill, lighthouse, Lysmere, Ailsa. She wrapped it in waxed paper and fastened it with thread. Then she gently tied a small brass lantern to the bird's leg, a keepsake from the lighthouse, no longer functional, but polished and catching light even in the gloom. "Find them," she whispered. "Please." Brisa looked into her eyes for a long moment. Then she took to the sky. Hours passed. Yuan slipped in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Ailsa sat beside him, clutching his hand, telling him stories of her childhood, the names of all the seabirds, the first time he had shown her how to light the beacon. The storm raged through the night. Morning came, grey and raw. And then, a noise. A helicopter. A Coast Guard team had been alerted by a ranger on the mainland. a strange bird with a brass lantern had landed near him, pecking until he noticed the note. Ewan survived. They called it a miracle, a tale for the news. But for Ailsa, it was something deeper. Proof that love, whether in feathers or flesh, could carry across oceans. Brisa returned weeks later, thinner but proud, as if she had always known she would make it back. Ewan eventually recovered fully, though he walked slower now, with a cane carved from driftwood Ailsa had collected. The story of the seabird with the lantern became legend on Lysmere. Tourists came to see the lighthouse. Ailsa and Ewan welcomed them, offering warm tea and stories. But sometimes, when dusk fell and the sea turned to fire under the setting sun, Ailsa would sit beneath the willow, Brisa on her shoulder, and remember that stormy night when love flew with a lantern in her beak. And when she was older, and Ewan finally passed, peacefully, with Brisa watching from the windowsill, Ailsa lit the old lighthouse lantern again, just once. Not because it was needed, but because love, like light, should always have a place to return to. Years later, long after the tourists faded and the stories quieted, a little girl with sea-salted hair would sit on those same cliffs and hear whispers of the seabird who flew through a storm carrying hope in her beak. Ailsa would smile and the light would shine on. Ailsa stayed on the island as she grew. She studied biology through correspondence courses and eventually became the island's unofficial wildlife caretaker. People on the mainland would bring injured birds and seals, and she'd rehabilitate them in the shed-turned sanctuary behind the cottage. Brisa, ever faithful, helped in her own way, calling to the others from the skies, bringing feathers and fish, as if passing along her knowledge. In her 20s, Ailsa took over as caretaker of the lighthouse. Though the light was automated, she maintained it religiously, cleaning the lens, tending to the tower, and occasionally using it for signaling during fog or distress. Her bond to the place was unbreakable. It wasn't about duty, it was about love, about memory. She kept the lantern Brisa once carried on a shelf above her bed, next to a photo of Ewan holding her as a baby, both of them squinting into the sea wind. One spring, a young man named Callum arrived with a broken radio and a boat engine that coughed more than it ran. He was a volunteer from the mainland's coastal conservation group, sent to help track puffin nesting. Ailsa met him at the dock, unimpressed by his city boots, but intrigued by the way he looked at the cliffs like they held secrets. Callum stayed longer than he intended. He helped with the birds, fixed the gutters on the cottage, and built a small bench beneath the willow tree. He listened to Ailsa's stories without interruption. When Brisa landed on his shoulder one evening, unprompted, Ailsa knew he would stay forever. They married quietly, with only the sea and Brisa as witnesses. A few seals poked their heads above the waves during the vows, and Ailsa swore they were smiling. Their daughter was born on a moonlit night, with the wind rustling the heather. They named her Isla after the sea. She had her mother's curiosity, and her father's calm, and Brisa guarded her like a feathered sentinel. As Ailsa grew, the island seemed to grow with her. New life blossomed in the cracks of old stories. But time, as always, moved forward. Brisa's feathers began to fade. Her flights grew shorter. She stopped bringing trinkets and began sleeping more beneath the willow. One morning, Ailsa found her there, eyes closed, chest still. They buried her beside the tree, under stones from the cliffs and flowers from the meadows. Ailsa placed the lantern at the head of the grave, where the sun would touch it each day. I wouldn't be here without her, Ailsa told Isla. And neither would I, Isla said. Years passed. Isla left for school, then returned with ideas about ecotourism and preserving the island's fragile beauty. She turned the lighthouse keeper's quarters into a small museum featuring Brisa's story, the old lantern, and the logbooks Ewan had kept, full of sea charts and love. Visitors came not just for the view, but for the legend. They left notes at Brisa's grave. Some brought trinkets of their own. And always, as dusk painted the sky and the waves softened, the lighthouse light blinked on. Not because it had to, but because some lights are meant to guide us home. Ailsa grew older, but never weary. The sea still called, and she still answered. And every time a storm rolled in, she would watch the sky and remember a seabird who once flew through the dark with a lantern in her beak. Because love, after all, was never meant to be grounded. It was meant to fly. Sometimes love doesn't need words. Sometimes it flies on silent wings, through storm and sky, to remind us that light never truly fades. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share it, because kindness, like Brisa's lantern, shines brighter when passed on.